She didn't know what she expected when the truck turned off the main road. Maybe a farmhouse with a porch light burning. Maybe a man who smiled when he saw her. What she got was a gravel driveway that seemed to go on forever, a house with one window lit like a warning, and a dog that barked twice and then went silent, as if it had decided she wasn't worth the effort. Lena Pruitt sat with her hands folded in her lap and told herself she was not afraid. She'd been telling herself that for 3 days. The man driving, a ranch hand named Cody, who worked for the county placement office and smelled like coffee and old tobacco, pulled up in front of the house and shifted the truck into park without a word. He'd said maybe 4 sentences the entire drive from Amarillo. She hadn't minded. She'd needed the quiet to think, and she'd used every mile of it to rehearse what she would say when she met Beckett Hale for the first time. Beckett Hale, her husband. She had a photograph. It had been included with the placement paperwork, tucked between a copy of the ranch deed and a summary of terms that read more like a lease agreement than a marriage contract. In the photograph, he was standing next to a fence post, not quite looking at the camera, one hand shading his eyes from the sun. He was tall. His jaw was dark with a few days of stubble. He wasn't smiling. She hadn't expected him to be smiling. She'd read enough about him from the caseworker's notes to understand that Beckett Hale didn't do much smiling anymore. His wife had died 14 months ago. A car accident on a county highway in February, black ice, no other vehicles involved. Her name had been Dara. She'd been 29. The notes didn't say much else about her, and Lena hadn't asked. Some things weren't hers to know yet. The arrangement had come through the Rural Resettlement Program, a quiet government initiative that matched women leaving domestic risk situations with landowners in remote areas who needed a working household partner. It was practical, it was legal, and it was, as the caseworker had explained with the kind of careful language people used when they didn't want to say something directly, entirely voluntary on both sides. Beckett Hale had applied 8 months ago. Lena had been assigned 3 weeks ago, after her own situation in Oklahoma City had reached the point where staying was no longer a choice. She didn't think about Oklahoma City if she could help it. Cody climbed out of the truck and retrieved her single bag from the bed. It was a duffel, army green, stuffed with everything she'd been able to carry. He set it on the gravel and gave her a nod like he was checking something off a list. "He knows you're coming," Cody said. "I called ahead." "I know," Lena said. "You told me, just so you're not surprised if he's..." Cody searched for the word. "Quiet. I'm not expecting a party." He nodded again and got back in the truck. She watched the taillights disappear down the drive. The night was very still. The Texas panhandle in early October carried a cold that wasn't deep yet but promised to be. She could hear cattle somewhere, far off, and the wind moving through dry grass and nothing else. She picked up her bag and walked to the front door and knocked. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. The man standing in the doorway was taller than his photographs suggested, and broader through the shoulders. He was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up and jeans that had seen real work. His hair was dark and he hadn't shaved recently, and his eyes, she noticed his eyes before anything else, were a gray-green that looked like weather coming in. He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. She thought, he didn't expect me to be this young. She thought, he didn't expect me to look like this at all. She kept her chin up and said, "I'm Lena Pruitt. I'm sorry it's late." He stepped back from the door. "Come in, that's all, come in." 2 words and a step backward, and that was her welcome to the rest of her life. The house was clean, which surprised her. She'd half prepared herself for a bachelor's wreckage, dishes in the sink, laundry on chairs, the specific disorder of a man living alone who had stopped caring. But the kitchen was scrubbed, the floors were swept, and there was a small lamp on the counter that gave the room a warmth the overhead light didn't quite manage. He showed her to a room at the end of the hall. "Bathrooms across," he said. "There's hot water in the morning, from about 6. The heater runs slow." "Okay," she said. "I get up at 4:30. "You don't have to. What time does the work start?" He looked at her. She noticed it again, the way he measured things before speaking, like he was calculating what words would cost him. "Depends on the season," he said. "Right now, 6. Feeding, checking fence lines, some repair before the ground freezes. I can be ready at 6. Another pause. "The placement paperwork said you worked in medical administration for 4 years. Yes, this isn't that." "I know what a ranch is," she said, more evenly than she felt. "I grew up in Claremore. My grandfather kept cattle." Something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, more like recalculation. "Get some sleep," he said. "There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry." He pulled the door closed behind him. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, with her duffel on her knees, and listened to his footsteps go down the hall. She heard the creak of a chair and the low sound of something, wind outside, or maybe the house settling. She did not let herself think about the man she'd left behind in Oklahoma City. She did not think about the bruise still fading along her collarbone, or the morning 3 weeks ago when she'd walked out of her apartment with one bag and her car keys and driven until she ran out of nerve, which had turned out to be a parking lot in Tulsa at 2 in the morning, and she'd sat there until dawn. And then she'd called the number a woman at the clinic had written on a card and pressed into her hand and said, "Use this if you need it." She'd needed it. She made herself lie down. She made herself close her eyes. Outside the window, the wind came across the flat dark land, and the cattle were still somewhere out there, and she was, for the first time in a long time, somewhere no one knew her name. She was asleep before she finished the thought. His name was Beckett, but he didn't offer it freely. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn the layout of a dark room, reaching until your hand finds something solid. He was 36. He'd inherited the ranch from his father at 22, and had run it alone since then except for 2 part-time hands who came in 3 days a week. He ate breakfast at 4:45, always the same thing: eggs, black coffee, 2 slices of toast. He didn't eat lunch. He stopped working at dusk, showered, ate dinner, and was in bed by 9. He was not unkind. That was the thing she kept coming back to in those first weeks. He wasn't warm, not exactly, not in the way that cost him anything, but he wasn't unkind. He thanked her when she cooked. He fixed the latch on her window without being asked when she mentioned it was stiff. When she made a mistake, forgetting to close the north gate, which she did on the 3rd day, her face burning when she realized. He corrected her once, plainly, without raising his voice, or letting the correction linger. She'd spent 3 years learning to brace for what came after a correction. The absence of it unsettled her almost as much as the original error. She worked hard. She'd told the truth about her grandfather, and ranch work came back to her body like a language she'd spoken in childhood. Uncomfortable at first, then gradually fluent. She learned the fence lines, and the water schedules, and the names of the cattle dogs, who were called Pepper and Roy. She learned that Beckett talked to the horses in a low voice when he thought no one was listening, and didn't seem embarrassed when she caught him at it. One morning in November, 6 weeks in, she came into the barn to find him sitting on an overturned bucket in the half-dark, his elbows on his knees, his head bent. He didn't hear her come in. She stopped and watched him for a moment, not out of curiosity, or at least she told herself it wasn't. And something about the way he sat, entirely still, entirely alone with whatever he was carrying, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. She backed out quietly and gave him the barn. That evening he came in for dinner and ate what she'd made. A pot of chili, cornbread from the box, not glamorous, and at the end he set his fork down and said, "This is good, thank you." And she said, "You're welcome." And there was a pause that was different from the other pauses, smaller somehow, less wide. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She'd been there 9 weeks when she saw the car. It was a Thursday late afternoon, the light going gold and flat across the fields. She was coming back from checking the east fence when she noticed a dark sedan idling at the end of the county road where it met the drive. It was too far to see clearly, but it wasn't moving, and nobody stopped at that intersection unless they were coming to the ranch. She watched it for a full minute. Then it pulled away slowly, heading north. She told herself it was nothing, a lost driver. Someone checking a map. She didn't mention it to Beckett. But the next morning, she woke early and lay in the dark and listened to the silence and found it wasn't comforting anymore. His name was Damon Reese, and she knew before she'd left Oklahoma City that he wouldn't let her go quietly. That was the thing about men like Damon. They didn't think of it as letting go. They thought of it as something being taken from them, something they owned. And Damon was, above everything else, a man who kept careful track of what he owned. He'd been 2 years building his position in the regional import network before she'd understood what she was living inside of. By then she'd already spent 18 months learning his moods and his routines, and the particular weight of his silence, before it turned into something worse. By the time she'd taken the card from the clinic woman's hand, she'd known exactly how careful she would have to be, And she'd been careful, and she'd thought. She had really believed that she'd been careful enough. She hadn't told anyone in Oklahoma City where the program was sending her. She hadn't used her phone after the first week. She had a new number now, a county-issued one, and she'd given it only to the caseworker. But Damon was patient in ways that frightened her, and he had resources. She saw the sedan again on a Tuesday. Same car, she was almost certain, same dark color, same dull chrome trim. This time it was parked on the far side of the highway overpass, half a mile from the turnoff. She was driving the ranch truck back from the feed store in Dalhart, and she passed it at 60 miles an hour, and she kept her eyes on the road, and her hands steady on the wheel. And she didn't breathe properly until she was back on the gravel drive, with the gate closed behind her. That evening she sat across the dinner table from Beckett and tried to think of a way to tell him. She'd rehearsed it a dozen times in her head, and it still came out wrong in every version. There's a man who may have found me. He's not good. I may have brought something dangerous to your land, to your house, to the life you're just barely holding together. She'd watched him in the weeks since she'd arrived, and she knew enough now to know that what Beckett Hale was doing, day by day, was surviving. Not gracefully, not easily. Just getting to the next morning and the one after that. She didn't know if she had the right to put something else on top of that. She said, "How long have you had the east fence?" He glanced up. "Since my father's time, maybe 30 years on the posts, some of the wires going. I know. I'm planning to pull and restring it in spring." She nodded and went back to her food. She didn't sleep that night. She told him on a Wednesday morning, 3 days later, because the choice was made for her. She'd gone to the mailbox at the end of the drive and found, tucked between a seed catalog and a county water bill addressed to Beckett, an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with her old Oklahoma City address printed on it, and below that, in Damon's handwriting, a number. Just a number. The number of a phone she'd thrown away 8 weeks ago. He was telling her he knew. He was telling her he'd been patient, and he was done. She stood at the end of the drive for a long time with the envelope in her hand. The sky was very wide and very pale. Pepper was sitting beside her, looking up at her with the specific concern that dogs have for people who have gone still. She walked back to the house. Beckett was at the kitchen table with his coffee and a parts catalog, and he looked up when she came in, and whatever he saw on her face made him set the catalog down. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a demand. It was the voice he used when one of the dogs was hurt and needed to be examined. Quiet, no alarm in it, just a steadiness that said, "I'm here. This is manageable. Let me see." She sat down and she told him everything. She started with Oklahoma City, and she went all the way through. Damon, the network, what she'd understood too late, the 18 months, the card, the program, the sedan at the overpass. She put the envelope on the table between them, and she watched his face while she talked. And his face didn't change the way she'd been afraid it would. He didn't get angry. He didn't push the envelope away or stand up or look at her like she'd deceived him. Even though she had, in a way, by not telling him sooner. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Beckett picked up the envelope and looked at it for a long moment. "How many times did you see the car?" he said. "Twice. Maybe the same one. I can't be certain. Same location? Different. First time at the end of our drive. Second time at the overpass on Route 54. He nodded slowly, still looking at the envelope. "You should have told me earlier," he said. "I know. I'm not." He stopped. "I'm not saying that to put it on you. I'm saying I could have been watching." "I know," she said again. "I'm sorry." He set the envelope down. He looked at her then, really looked at her in a way he hadn't before, without the careful distance he usually kept between himself and the things that were close to him. "What does he want?" Beckett said. And Lena said, very quietly, "He wants me to come back." Something moved through Beckett's eyes. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was anger somewhere underneath it. It was something older and quieter, and she didn't quite have a word for it. "You're not going back," he said. It was the same voice. Steady. No question in it. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been held tight. For so long, she'd stopped noticing it. Beckett called the county sheriff that morning. He knew the man. They'd grown up in the same district, gone to the same school a year apart. The sheriff's name was Trout, which was not a name that inspired confidence, but turned out to be attached to a competent and serious man who listened without interrupting and asked good questions. Trout made calls. Within 24 hours, they had a description of the vehicle run against out-of-state plates and a name attached to it that connected back to a rental in Amarillo, paid with a card traced to a shell company that Damon's network had been using for transport logistics. It was a thread, and Trout pulled it carefully, and it connected to a federal task force that had been building a case on the network for 2 years. Lena sat in Trout's office on a Friday afternoon and answered questions for 3 hours. She was steady the whole time. She answered everything. She gave them the names she knew and the dates she remembered and the locations she'd been careful never to mention to anyone until now. When she came out of the office, Beckett was sitting in the waiting room with his hat on his knee. She hadn't asked him to come. He'd said he was driving her, and she hadn't argued, and she'd been glad of it every minute of those 3 hours. "Okay," he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, "It's done. I mean, there's more. There'll be more. But the hardest part is done." He stood and put his hat on and held the door for her, and didn't say anything else, and that was exactly right. The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were survivable, and after everything she'd been through, survivable felt like grace. The task force moved on the network in December. Damon Reese was arrested at a storage facility outside of Tulsa on a Wednesday morning, along with 3 associates, whose names she recognized and 4 she didn't. The charges were extensive. The caseworker called her to tell her, and Lena stood in the kitchen with the phone against her ear and looked out the window at the frozen fields and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not relief, because relief implied the fear was gone. And some fears lived in the body long after the reason for them was removed. But something close to it. Something that breathed. She was still standing there when Beckett came in from the barn. He looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "They got him," she said. "This morning." He was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed to the counter and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood beside her, both of them looking out the window at the same flat gray sky. "Good," he said. She nodded. They stood there for a while, not saying anything, their shoulders almost but not quite touching, and outside the wind moved across the land, and somewhere the cattle were moving, and the whole wide empty reach of the panhandle went on to the horizon, and didn't ask anything of either of them. It was Pepper who understood things first, the way dogs always do. The dog had adopted Lena sometime in November, quietly transferring her allegiance with the complete confidence of an animal who had made a sound decision. By December, Pepper slept outside Lena's door, and followed her to the barn in the mornings, and sat with her head on Lena's knee in the evenings when they were in the sitting room, which they had taken to sharing after dinner, instead of retreating to opposite ends of the house, as they had in the beginning. Beckett noticed, of course. Beckett noticed everything, though he said little about what he observed. One evening in late December, the first real snow of the season coming down outside the window, Lena was reading, and Pepper was asleep, and Beckett was at the table with a ledger, and he said, "We don't have to stay." She looked over at him. "What?" "After everything settles," he said. "With the case, the network, when it's finished. You don't have to stay here. The program doesn't require." He stopped, tried again. "You have options. I want you to know that." She considered him for a moment. The lamp was low, and the snow was quiet, and his face was turned down toward the ledger, and he was trying very hard to be fair to her. She thought about Oklahoma City. She thought about the apartment and the brews and the parking lot in Tulsa at 2 in the morning. She thought about the drive across the panhandle in Cody's truck, the window lit like a warning, the dog that barked twice and stopped. She thought about a man sitting on an overturned bucket in a dark barn, alone with whatever he carried. "I know I have options," she said. He finally looked up. "I'm not staying because I have to," she said. "I think you know that by now." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his face, careful and slow and real. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He went back to the ledger. She went back to her book. Pepper slept on. The snow came down in the dark outside and covered the fields and the fence lines and the long gravel drive, and the house was warm, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lena Pruitt did not feel like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. She felt, in the quietest and most careful way, like someone who had arrived somewhere. Spring came slow to the panhandle the way it always did, grudging, a few degrees at a time, the grass coming back tentative and pale. By March, the east fence was repaired, and the herd was healthy, and there were 2 new calves. both of whom Lena had names, for that Beckett pretended not to use, and then used when he thought she wasn't listening. One morning in April she woke before 4, and lay in the dark and listened to the house, and understood that somewhere in the past 6 months the sounds of this place had become the sounds of home. The particular creak of the third floorboard in the hall, the way the wind worked its way under the north eave, the sound of Beckett moving quietly through the kitchen, the coffee beginning, the morning starting without ceremony, exactly as it always had and would. She got up, she got dressed, she went to the kitchen. He looked at her when she came in, and this time, for the first time, he smiled. It was small and a little uncertain, like something he hadn't done in a while and wasn't entirely sure still fit his face. But it was real. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "I'll take the morning feeding. I'll come with you," he said. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edge of the world, a thin line of something almost pink. The air was cold and clean and smelled like thaw and new grass, and the cattle were moving in the east pasture, and Roy was at their heels, and Pepper was trotting ahead like she knew where they were going, because she always did. Beckett walked beside her, and their breath showed in the cold air, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and it wasn't the silence of distance anymore. It was the silence of two people who had learned each other slowly and trusted what they'd found, and didn't need to fill it. The sun came up over the flat edge of Texas and lit the whole wide land gold, and Lena Pruitt watched it and thought that this exact ordinary irreplaceable morning was what she had been trying to get to all along.